Ebola viral disease, the exact name that has gotten the world talking about this. A lot of fear-mongering that has been going on, but also facts that have been put out there, a lot of lies as well, myths that are still as well capturing some of the headlines we see. But worrisome is the deaths. Many people have been killed by this disease, especially in West Africa. Other countries, including the powerhouse in the world, United States of America, is seeing a few cases. I think the most recent one being in New York, reported there. And the question is, are there enough measures here at home to deal with this disease? Because we have had experts even from WHO talk about it just being perhaps just a matter of time before Kenya has her first case of Ebola. There have been a number of scares, but none of them, thank God, has been an actual Ebola case. But there have been concerns on Kenya's preparedness, and that's what we want to talk about. And also keeping in mind, tonight, 14 Kenyans will be jetting back into the country from Liberia, one of the worst affected countries by this disease. So what measures have been put in place to ensure that these 14, as they're brought back into the country, are monitored carefully to just ensure they're okay, they're in the clear before being reintegrated back to the population? And joining me this morning in studio, two guests, Dr. Victor Ngani, who's the chairman of the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists and Dentists Union. Also with me is the Association of Kenya Medical Laboratories Scientific Officers, the chair of that, National Executive Chairman Moses C. Olore as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. A mouthful there before I got to you. But let's begin with you, Ngani, in as far as your thoughts in Kenya's preparedness, because that is the major focus. Before even we talk about how this has played out around the world and especially in West Africa, Kenya, since this story broke, how has Kenya handled this?
Well, initially, we were a bit slow to respond, and we had a department, Disease Surveillance and Response Unit, which was handling preparedness. They do this for most diseases. And we felt as a union that initially our response was a bit slow. We raised this, and I think you've noticed a bit of a change in the last 2 weeks or so. And we had specifically said we are concerned about key components of controlling Ebola. The first is public education. And now we can see a bit more presence in the media, people being educated. And this is important because if you look at the Mali case, the grandmother to the child traveled 1,000 kilometers with a child from an affected country with symptoms. If she had been educated appropriately, maybe this would have gone differently. The second issue we had was that the health workers didn't feel adequately trained. Less than 5% knew what the case definition of Ebola was. And now we have confirmed that a program is being rolled out. We had also raised a concern that the protocols for managing Ebola had not been disseminated appropriately. The personal protective equipment had not been disseminated properly through the various facilities. Our screening processes were lax, and this was a fact. Now we had a meeting with the cabinet secretary and the director of medical services on Tuesday as a union, and we went through each and every one of these areas, and we can confidently say that perhaps now we are headed in the right direction, and we are on the right track. Specifically, when it comes to screening, the ministry is acquiring thermal scanners. We expect that this could be in latest this week. This is different from the temperature gun you see the health workers using. This scans people automatically, removing room for human error. So the moment you have a high fever, automatically detected, and this will be put at the various ports of entry. So
on a scale of 1 to 10, you rank Kenya on what?
Well, if the measures that have been put in place are effected appropriately, we may get to 70% prepared. But that's we are looking at the end of November for that to be possible.
For that to be possible.
Yes, because we are also creating an isolation unit in Kenyatta. It's not yet done. Before that is completely done, we can't say that we are fully ready. Before all the health workers have been trained, or at least 50% have been trained, we can't say we are fully ready.
Okay, and we'll dive into some of those issues you've highlighted, because that's just an isolation unit in Kenyatta. What happens to the rest of the country? Yeah. Let's bring in Laura. Your thoughts on Kenya's preparedness?
Initially, in fact, if Dr. Ngani might recall, I think I raised the red flag on this in this studio.
Yeah.
And when we had our conference between the 8th and 10th of October, I actually did a press and said, we are playing with a very serious disease, and our preparedness was lapse. We were not ready for the disease. And as he rightly says, I'm glad that in the last few days there's been a lot of activity in the government to try and correct this. The truth is that we are not yet there. A lot more needs to be done, and more because Ebola is not a straightforward disease. There are a lot of complexities. There are a lot of things which have not been understood. One of them being even the natural host for the disease. Nobody, as we are speaking today, and Dr. Ngani might want to comment on that, nobody actually knows where this disease actually habitates. It's only guessed that probably the natural host is some wild bats, some apes and monkeys, wild fruit that are eaten, and so there is no definitive host, and therefore even the origin of the disease is not clear.
But in as far as the preparedness now, that is there, the disease, before we go into now the bigger picture of resolving the problem.
Actually, that's why I'm heading to that. By asserting that, I'm saying that with that complexity of not understanding the source, preparedness becomes a major issue. It becomes a real critical issue that requires involvement of not only the professionals but the public. And if you ask me, yes, there's been a lot of public message out there in the media and everywhere, but a lot of that message is scary, if you ask me.
But it's a scary disease.
Yes, but scary to the extent that if you're told, for example, if you suspect somebody has Ebola, don't touch, don't do this, then how are you supposed to contain it? Yeah, and therefore, as the government, ups the efforts to try and control this, I think public awareness is very, very critical. Training of a lot of the healthcare workers and even the support workers is very critical, so that they have the right information, they have the right things to do, they have the right equipment. Because training alone is not enough. They have to have the right equipment, they have to have the right attitude. So that, because if health workers are scared, how about the general public? So
in your view, the public awareness is more spreading fear than information?
The way, if you look at the clips on the TV, the way it's being put, so, at the moment, in my opinion, it's spreading a lot of fear, because one, like Ngani said, even the health workers, we have trained very few at the moment. The health workers are the first line. They deal with people in the counties, so they need to have a lot of information to remove this fear, talk to the people around them.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Ngani, are we spreading fear or information?
Well, I think when you spread information, it's invariable that there'll be a bit of fear, because it is a fearful disease, as you rightfully said. But I have to say that it's absolutely critical that public education on Ebola is done, because they're almost the first line of defense. I think this cannot be emphasized enough. If you look at the spread of Ebola in the West African countries, it came about as a result of practices, in the cultural practices. One of them is how they handle the dead, for example. Practice of going to hospitals when people are sick, how they respond to healthcare provision. Do they trust the health workers? So these kinds of concerns allowed Ebola to get out of hand in some of those countries, of course added to failure to have a robust healthcare system. So indeed, whenever we give these messages, people get fearful. And there's reason to be. But it's also important to understand that the purpose of this message is to teach us how not to get Ebola, and even if it were to come in, then how to ensure it's controlled. We may have to do away with physical greetings, do away with keeping our dead for 2 weeks before you bury them. All these are things you have to contemplate. But then, importantly, with education, you now know why we are burying the dead after 1 day, where we are adopting different practices from our cultures.
The medical officers at the JKIA had raised concern that the gun temperature readers you were talking about were giving different readings, and that then it was not accurate. You'd not actually know the real temperature of a particular person, and that tracking of those people coming through the airport, that was not happening. Do you know if things have changed?
One of the things is, for as long as you're using the thermal gun, it's not perfectly accurate. It's the best we can do, because you can't use a contact thermometer, and the alternative is to do what is now being done, which is the thermal scanners. My expectation is that by the end of this week, this should be in place, and if it's not in place, and maybe we need to go to the ministry and ask them why this is so. Another important factor in having a thermal scanner is because if you have persons, there's always room for human error, and there's room for fatigue, and there's room for demotivation, and there's room for fear. When you replace that with an automated system that can scan 4 or 5 people at a go, then you increase your chance of screening everybody. If you have maybe lots of flights have just come at the same time, there's a chance that some people would be missed. So definitely the thermal scanners are a bit more accurate, they're a bit more reliable, and that's the direction I'm glad the ministry has chosen to go.
But checking the temperature is not enough, sir, because the bigger problem is that there are many who will come, exhibit no symptoms, but in the days after, because there's a 21-day incubation, then start to show these symptoms.
Absolutely, and that's really the government or even the health workers, there's very little they can do. But that now means that we need to really emphasize the training, the case identification, the monitoring. For example, if you look at the case definition of who is a suspected Ebola person, they need to have come from areas that are now currently affected by the virus. So monitoring these people, how they move. For example, the example you gave, our Kenyans are coming back, 14 of them from Liberia.
And we'll talk about that shortly, yes.
It would be very, very critical that how do we deal with this? We know they have been from that source, so how do we deal with them? The obvious answer, if you ask me, would be to have them quarantined for at least the 21 days, so that we are sure that it's a stringent and extreme measure, but that is the least that needs to be done.
Do you agree with that? Because the ministry says apparently those 14 Kenyans that are coming back into the country from Liberia today will be quarantined.
Well, first, one of the gaps in the screening we are doing right now is that if you came in asymptomatic, and probably not even asymptomatic, just without fever, because fever occurs in only 85% of the cases. There's a 15% who will not have fever, they'll have other symptoms before. Then for sure you won't pick them up. If somebody is in the first few days of an Ebola infection, you will not pick them up. So this lapse occurs. The unfortunate thing about Ebola is that before you become symptomatic, you are not actually infectious. And in fact, the virus load increases progressively. And if you look at the case in the United States, for example, Mr. Duncan, and 4 days, developed symptoms 4 days later, and you realize that none of the contacts he had outside of the hospitals contracted the disease.
So contacts before the symptoms develop
are unlikely to spread the case. And in fact, the recommendation now is, if you've been in contact with somebody who has Ebola, then what you'll do is called self-quarantine, where you stay at home and you take your temperature twice a day. If you develop a fever, then you become a suspect case. Now, if you don't develop any symptoms, then it's my view that you do not need to be in an isolation facility. You don't need to be put aside, and that's quite important. The thing we want to do is to avoid stigmatization. As health workers, you have to be in the front line fighting this disease. It's scary. I mean, for me, I have a small girl, 3.5 years old. But if Ebola were to come to this country, it's my responsibility at some point to try and ensure this is mitigated. If it's not mitigated, it comes back around and it's all of us.
Yeah.
So if I took the initiative to go to Liberia, for example, and learn how to handle this process, then I'd want to be treated better. Now, it's a difficult balance, but it's important to understand, let's respond appropriately based on fact, not really too much of the fear.
So what do you think of what the Ministry of Health and as well as Foreign Affairs is saying as far as how they plan to handle the Kenyans coming back from Liberia today?
Well, my view, I can only say what my expectation is, that all these 14, they will be screened at the port of entry. If they exhibit any symptoms, then they would be treated as suspect cases. If they don't exhibit symptoms, then they'll have to do self-quarantine at the various homes and check.
So you'd have them go home still?
Absolutely, because if you don't have any symptoms, you're not infectious. I think this is important, and it's a big debate right now.
But the problem is, for some, before even maybe they realize it, it's such a thin line to leave that room. For you go home and you develop symptoms, come really fast.
Sophia, this is the thing about fear, and I think that's the point. There should be a big distinction between fear and information. The information part of it is this: if you don't have symptoms, you're not infectious. And therefore, if you have health workers who are checking their temperatures twice a day, morning and evening, you check your temperature, and you don't have a fever, you don't feel fatigued, you don't have all these symptoms, then for sure, it's unlikely you're going to infect anybody. And you're also doing self-quarantine in your home. So you're not oscillating around the town.
But most of these people don't live alone. You'll imagine some of them, Lore, will have other people in the house. And also, when these symptoms then do exhibit, I doubt they say, we are coming, we are on our way, it will happen. And then maybe when somebody's trying to help you out, that contact
absolutely
happens.
That's why I said this is a very complex disease, given the fact that there are a lot of things you don't understand about the disease. But like Victor rightly says, if we have in place monitoring tools and monitoring systems, so that as these people arrive, those that are found to exhibit some of those symptoms will automatically be isolated. Those that go home and exercise what we call self-quarantine, they must be monitored. Because without the monitoring, case follow-ups, that is where now we lose it. They must be monitored, like he says, their temperature is taken on a regular basis to see if there is any deviation from the norm. If that happens, then they are taken as suspects and treated the way they are supposed to be treated. Well, because otherwise, what will happen? We live in a tropical country with a lot of...
That for me still sounds very chancy, saying being in such an area, although we are seeing the ministry saying that they will be quarantined for 21 days. You're talking about how it is they'll be quarantined. I guess that's very important to see what kind of treatment they'll receive if in fact that does happen for the 21 days. But before we continue the discussion, let's listen to what Kofi Annan had to say about this virus. World leaders have come out to comment about it, talking about it, eventually becoming a crisis or even a catastrophe for the world. It is a crisis, I think, in West Africa already. But this is what Kofi Annan had to say about Ebola viral disease.
Elsewhere other than Africa, the response would have been faster. And if the disease had emerged in a richer country, we would have today have a medication or vaccine. We've known about Ebola for 40 years, but it's a poor man's disease.
Is it a poor man's disease?
Wow.
Yes. And if you look at where Ebola comes from, you don't know who the natural host is, but that natural host infects wild animals. And those people eat bushmeat, baboons, apes, wild antelopes, then that's commonly how we've contracted Ebola. But as Kofi Annan rightly says, Ebola is not new. It has been there since 1965. We had outbreaks in 1976. We've had all these outbreaks progressively over a number of years. And it's only in 2014 that we're now seeing a big push towards a vaccine, big push towards trying to get treatment. And yes, in that regard, he may have a point that if it had happened, if you'd been having these outbreaks in other countries, then maybe we could see a different outcome. However, I have to mention that there have been cases, the Reston Ebola virus, for example, was found in America a couple of years ago, and also sometime in Germany. Now, there's another angle to this as well. One of the things that is also for us Africans is we are highly dependent on other people. We, for example, have neglected our healthcare systems, and when catastrophe lands upon us, then we say, oh, West, help us. We have to learn to build our own systems. The West African Ebola outbreak, a big reason why they went out of hand is because they didn't have proper investment in the healthcare system. Just as much as the same challenge we're having in our own country. We don't see that these catastrophes can happen. It's mandatory that each and every Kenyan actually considers healthcare as an important component and makes the right investment towards this.
Towards it, okay.
I may have to add something. If you look at the case of the 2 American missionaries who survived, the suggestion was that they survived because of the medicine. But it's possible that the quality of healthcare they received is dramatically different from what is being given to our colleagues in West Africa.
But what about the one who died? Was he not given the same? Would that be your argument as well?
Well, in disease, we talk about mortality rates. In West Africa, we are seeing anywhere between 50 and 90% mortality. In America, if you look at the mortality, it's less than 20%. That's a big difference. It's possibly due to the treatments. And if you look at outbreaks elsewhere in the past, we've had 30% mortality in some countries, and this can only be explained by the robust system.
So do you agree with the former UN Secretary General?
For me, it's a yes and no. Yes, because this disease has really been concentrated in poor countries. Maybe because of the natural history where the virus resides, as past scientific research shows, relating it to the African countries mostly. But no, because really you can't say it, the context must be very different. You can't say it's a poor man's disease. It has killed rich people. Yeah, this is a disease which unfortunately is more widespread in the African continent, in the poor countries, but there's a disease that can affect everybody. The angle that comes in is that, like Dr. Ngani says, is that our preparedness is very minimal. Our health systems are dilapidated. We have, if you look at a country like Liberia, just emerging from war, actually the health system is almost
non-existent.
Doesn't exist. So you don't expect them to. If you look at a country like Guinea, all right. So these are things that we have to bear in mind. And as a country, why some of us in the advocacy have made noise is that we need to learn better. Look at we are neighboring Uganda, which has reported cases of Ebola in the past. The Marburg virus is more deadly than the Ebola virus, and it's just in our neighborhood. This means that as a country, we need to invest more in the preparedness. We need to upscale our activities on public and health professional awareness so that we are able to deal with it. It is, like you've seen in the best health systems in America, still people are affected, people have died. So you can imagine if we had cases here with the situation in which we are, it would be terrible.
To ban flights, to restrict the flights to and from affected areas, especially here at home, arriving at that decision, do you think it has helped in just securing Kenya from having an Ebola
Absolutely.
case?
And in fact, this is one of the cases we discussed the DMS earlier. The question was, is it discriminatory? Are we helping or worsening the situation for the West African countries? And it's my opinion. I think this should be shared really, that we've seen direct flights is a means of transfer, transmission of the Ebola virus. So ensuring that we control Ebola in the places where there's an outbreak is an important component to controlling the disease. Now, it may sound anti-good neighbor sort of, but
yes, and they have complained and said in our hour of need, you have abandoned us.
But rather than that, we could send health workers as being proposed. We can send finances. We can have the whole world bring in equipment. But the best hope for the world is to control Ebola in the countries where they exist. And if you had direct flights, there's a possibility that one of those people coming in from Liberia would have Ebola, and by the time we pick it up, it's too late. And I think that's not a risk we should willingly embrace as a people. It's not because you're not brotherly, but because we just have to be prudent and make wise decisions.
Many have argued that the world perhaps did not seriously take this in the initial breakout, that it is now that everybody is realizing, wow, it is getting out of hand, and more concerted efforts from around the globe coming together to help. Is it correct, that assessment, that perhaps the West African countries were left on their own for far too long, and that more attention, as each country prepares and protects itself, needs to be ensuring that they're perhaps helping out there as well? Because if that is not sorted out, then everyone continues to remain in danger.
Absolutely. And Sophie, one of the things that is really worrying to me, last week I just received on the social media, I don't know whether Dr. you've come across this, but the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, CIDRAP, at the University of Minnesota, are just toying with this idea that actually Ebola could be airborne. And you see, this is strongly suggested by some of case studies that have been done in the past, that we have had cases where people have contracted Ebola, or study apes have contracted Ebola without contact. And this raises a lot of concern. It raises a lot of issues that everybody, including the Western countries, we must do more than, because as we are speaking now, people are saying direct contact is the surest way. And if you have abrasions and things like that, if you're injected with blood that has got the Ebola virus, but there are certain, like the American nurse who got this, all the protocols were supposed to have been observed. Now they are querying maybe they didn't. But if you look at it critically, maybe there is a transmission mode that has not been understood, and the University of Minnesota, through some of their researchers, are postulating that it could be, actually there's a chance that Ebola is airborne, and that could be very scary. It means even here locally, as we talk about preparedness, then the equipment that the medical workers are going to use, we must relook at the specifications.
Actually, I have to add on that. It's not postulation, it's actually a fact that Ebola has been transmitted through air. And this is primarily in the apes, it's confirmed. Then in 1995, there was a case in DRC where a patient underwent surgery, and an Ebola patient, and all the health personnel contracted the disease, and the way they contracted this was it was airborne transmission through what we call aerosolized fluid. So this is confirmed. The only thing is that the transmission is not as aggressive in humans, and it's not been documented beyond that case in DRC. Now, obviously, when you look at the cases as they are, then that possibility of airborne transmission is actually very valid, and I wouldn't be surprised if the current research by Minnesota team comes up positive.
Yeah,
so it's definitely an area of concern as well.
All right, we want to listen to a doctor from Liberia who apparently uses HIV drugs to cure Ebola. Let's hear what he has to say.
Started to treat people in a form of an experimental study, a medication referred to as lamivudine. This medication is an antiviral drug. In 1988, it was invented in the US. Initially, they used it to treat people with viral hepatitis, especially hepatitis B virus. It was tested on the first patient, and then the patient survived. The second, the patient, they also survived. The third, and we went up to about 15, cases that this medication was tried on. Other than normal, 13 of them survived. 2 died. Even the 2 that died, had other comorbidity. The other patient was a known heart failure patient before the Ebola caught him, and the other person was a known hypertensive. Beginning.
Okay, what do you have to say to that, Laurie?
Well, I mean, is like he rightly says, is doing it on an experimental basis, so it is not something that is confirmed. But Ebola being a virus, I mean, you could try any antiretroviral. So it would not be surprising if some of the HIV drugs could show some effects on the Ebola virus. The one thing that is very different from the Ebola virus is that it attacks a lot of the body cells. If you look at HIV or other viruses, they attack specific cells. If you look at like the hepatitis virus that is saying, it specifically attacks the liver cells. But the Ebola virus, why even the fatalities are very high, is that it attacks epithelial cells almost all over the body. And that makes it even more complex. So that a lot of routine HIV drugs would actually kill the patient faster because it will be destroying almost all the cells.
Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, right now, there's a lot of research going into Ebola, and we are seeing a lot of novel ideas coming out. I'm not surprised by what the doctor says, because one of the categories that has been identified are called nucleoside analog drugs. These are usually part of the HIV regimen, and there's a very big study that has shown promise in the use of antiretrovirals towards treating Ebola. I mean, that particular group of drugs. So this is possibly what is being witnessed, and there's a very good chance that could be true. Beyond this, there's a vaccine that is promising, and WHO projects that we'll have millions of these by the end of next year. Now, there's something you said earlier. Were we slow to respond to Ebola? Of course you were, because in Guinea, there was Ebola by the end of 2013, and the very first time WHO spoke about Ebola was in March 2014. That is more than 3 months later, actually more than 4 months later, it got out of hand at that point. Treatment-wise, there's a lot of promise that there could be a vaccine available and various treatment options.
When we talk about treatment, what happened to what cured these 2 doctors in the US? This medication that they took and worked like a charm. Yes.
Zimap. Now, I think that's what I'm trying to say. If you talk to the doctors in the United States who treated the patients, they said it is not the Zimap that cured them, it's the quality of care. Because if you look at some of the standard protocols that are used on the patients in West Africa, they don't get 10% of what the missionaries got in America. A country that has invested in healthcare system gives better healthcare system. We have the same examples here in our own country. A peripheral clinic in the village compared to a private hospital in Nairobi, the difference in care is like day and night. And people die all the time of things that they shouldn't die of from these facilities that are underinvested in, while you can treat serious issues, do open heart surgery in a 2-week-old child in a private hospital in Nairobi. Light and day in the same country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Laura, the nurses that are said, I think either they've already traveled or there are plans for them to travel to West Africa to support in this fight against Ebola. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, like Dr. mentioned earlier, as health workers, regardless of the risks, we take a solemn oath that we will struggle to protect life. I think is a noble thing. The only thing that I need to add is that the government needs to ensure that they have all the necessary training, all the necessary protective equipment as they go there, so that they're not unnecessarily or unduly exposed. But otherwise, it's a good gesture. I mean, you heard what Dr. said. At the end of the day, the 3.5-year-old baby if it came to fighting for people's lives, they would do it.
Because
yes,
because Dr. Ngani, as he says, it's a good gesture as neighbors to do that. But some of the concerns for Kenyans would be in Spain, even in America, some of those cases have been gotten from the medical workers, from these nurses, so that as you send out these nurses, it could be the same good gesture that could come back to bite us.
US President Barack Obama said a very important thing. Investing in the West African Ebola case is investing in the US healthcare system. The same for us. If the world does not control Ebola in the West African states, we are all at risk. And in that case, it's only a matter of time before we have it in our own country. If it takes 300 healthcare workers from Kenya and several other countries to control this virus, then that is what we must do. Because the alternative is unacceptable. And it simply says, because most of those healthcare systems are now completely out. Most of the health workers have left the facilities. A lot of the people controlling the disease are now volunteers from other countries. If we don't control it there, we'll receive it here. And I promise you, we are not going to handle it if it's a complete outbreak.
Okay.
So it's not only a good thing, but it's necessary. I only have to say this. This must be voluntary. Anybody who's going to the West African states must volunteer to do so. They must receive adequate training, they must receive adequate protection, and they must be insured. I think that is just really important. I think this is something we've not embraced as a country, but the truth is, working in a hospital is a high risk. Right now, 5% of all the cases of Ebola are health workers, and of this 5%, 55% have passed away. That's a very big price to pay.
We have a caller online who's calling us from Bungoma, Charles Masinde. I understand he was in Liberia and returned in August. Charles, good morning.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much for calling. You had some contributions perhaps you can share with us before we engage with you a little bit more.
Absolutely, yes. I've been in West Africa since 2012. And I have been working there as a consultant for UNHCR.
May we have some more volume? Just sorry, Charles, we cannot make out what you're saying. Would you get some more volume in studio?
Okay.
People?
Yeah. Hi there. Yes, I just want to share with you. I think it's a very important subject. I left Roberts Airport, which is Monrovia, on the 6th of August, after realizing that the outbreak was getting extremely worse. And when I left, one of the biggest problems that the Liberian people experience is that the culture is very, very difficult. They still very backward in education. They eat everything. They even eat monkeys and bats. And these are some of the items that are said to carry the virus. The culture is very strong, even when it comes to burial rites. It's very lucky that I'm very, very correct that Kenya Airways took the decision, and the government took the decision it took. It would be difficult for that country to get out of the current problems of Ebola unless very, very stringent measures are taken to continue isolating the area. Right now, as we talk, several people have lost their jobs, and I personally don't have any plans to go back to Liberia. I don't know what the government is going to do about people who have left Liberia because of Ebola, because even some of the organizations, especially the private organizations that are asking people to go back, they have no plans on how to ensure that people are safe. When you look at the insurance programs being offered right now, they're completely inadequate. And there's no way, there's no evacuation plan. If somebody, for example, working in Liberia today fell sick from a very normal thing like typhoid, which is very common, you would not be sure where to go for treatment. At the time of my departure, I would not even accept change. If I gave you, say, $100 Liberian, and I was buying something for $20 Liberian, I would not accept change.
Okay, Charles, we'll end it there. Thank you so much. The line also not very clear. I don't know if you've been able to pick out anything from what Masinde was talking about.
Yes, he has basically mentioned that because of the cultural practices in some of those states, eating bats and wild animals is a delicacy, and these are highly affected by Ebola, and that's why they caught the Ebola in the first place. I mean, in DRC, a separate kind of an outbreak, a pregnant lady contracted Ebola after the husband killed bushmeat and took to her to slaughter. So this is a definite factor. He's also mentioned cultural practices. He has said that, and this is correctly so, that the insurance being offered is inadequate. And I particularly feel for the health workers, because at the end of the day, we have to contribute towards controlling Ebola, because if we don't do that, it will come to us, and we are also patients. But it's a very big risk, and and I'm wondering, is it something we appreciate as a country? Is it something that we can do anything about to ensure these health workers feel safe and appreciated? It's a difficult question.
All right. Let's talk about the setting up of the quarantine center here. That being constructed now, it appears, well, on one hand, yes, it is good to have that, but what happens to the rest of the country?
Well, I mean, I'm sure your guess is as good as mine. We would really prefer a situation where we had a few, if again they're expensive, but at least at the major risk areas, for example, our porous borders around Busia, Malaba, that region could probably have. Again, in Mombasa, being whatever it is, that region could have. But speaking about the isolation centers, you remember when we went to the press and said we are not ready? We got calls from all quarters and say, we are ready. I said, no, you are not ready. Because you are talking about an isolation facility at JKA, which is not even properly fitted. That has now been proved by the activities that they're undertaking. When we had a scare, when the lady died at the airport, everybody, the whole world saw how unprepared we were. But having said all that, our aim then was not to paint the government in bad picture, but to give them a wake-up call that, look guys, you are sleeping on something that if it strikes, all of us are in grave danger. But I'm glad that all that now is behind us. There's a raft of activities going on. You have seen the construction is going on.
But if the case happened today? God forbid.
God forbid, yes. And
because construction is going on.
Yeah, God forbid, but we will still use the old facility that we had, which will not be as fully equipped as the new facility is. The only encouragement we have is that, unlike then, right now we have a lot more staff who have been trained. I believe the approach that the JK are taking is different from what they took 2 weeks ago. They have been updated in their training. There is more rigorous checking of the people who are coming. So God forbid, if it happened today, we'll struggle with it. Yeah, but hopefully what the government is doing, they don't stop in the middle. We are on the right track. Like Dr. said earlier, we need to take it to the top. I mean, normally the best defense is attack. You attack the source.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we get prepared.
And as you contribute, we're seeing that activity here at the center in the capital. But you'd imagine with devolved government that you'd be, and now healthcare being under their mandate, there'd be more activity as well for them coming out to either even have their own messages to the public, their own campaigns running, and also just even if it's isolation centers that are tented, I don't know, would that be an option?
Well, first talking about the devolved systems, I think that one is just trying to rub a sore wound because there are things we really need to do better we have not done.
Yeah.
But you're right, I think we should see the county governments taking up that responsibility a bit more. If they've taken up the function, then they should run with it. And I mean, there's nothing bigger than Ebola right now. So we should be seeing a lot of messages from the county governments. But with regard to isolation in other facilities, we have what are referred to as makeshift isolation centers. They're not good. They're not that good, but it's what we have.
Yeah.
There also are tents available in various border points that have been circulated. These are temporary. They're not at the class of what is being constructed. But in the event that we train our workers adequately, provide the protective equipment adequately, and the public is well educated, then this makeshift may actually be sufficient, and then you transfer a confirmed case to the new center, which will be ready at the end of this month. So there is some activity that is moving us forward, as Mr. Lori has said.
All right.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, finally, from each of you, what is it that must be done going forward here on out, especially using whatever it is you'll say as a comparison with what we're seeing in the US and how they've been handling this as well?
For me, everything else is happening, but public awareness.
You feel it's public scare?
Public awareness. As the training of the professionals is going on, because this will not be done in one day. It is, stepwise, and we hope that by the end of some period, a lot of the health workers will have been trained, and therefore they will help to disseminate the correct information. But as it is now, even in barazas,
let's talk about Ebola. Finally.
Yeah, actually, I agree 100% with what you said. And in fact, everyone asks me, are we ready? The question I ask you, do you know enough about Ebola as a citizen?
Are you ready?
Because the moment you feel you know, then it means that we are ready. But that's one component. The second component is training of health personnel. I know the ministry intends to train about 20,000 by the end of next month, but our hope is that that number will be achieved and all healthcare personnel will be trained. Okay. Then we have to circulate protective equipment adequately. We have to do protocols. Now, I had a protocol from the Mater Hospital because this is an institution that has done a committee, as every hospital should do.
Yes.
In addition to this, do the protocols and ensure that you have a patient flow. Simulate it to ensure that in case of a case, you know what to do.
You know exactly
this has to
how
be done by each and every hospital, whether you're private or public. And beyond that, I think the rest of it we pray to God. Now, something very important.
Very briefly.
Yes. As a country, we have neglected our healthcare system. Let this be a wake-up call. Let's invest in our public healthcare institutions. Okay. Let's invest in our health workers. If we don't do this, we may just face what's happening in West Africa. If not Ebola, something else in future.
Something else. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Association of Kenya Medical Laboratories Scientific Offices National Executive Chairman, my extreme left, Moses C.O. Laura, and Dr. Victor Ngani, who's Chairman of the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists and Dentists Union, with us this morning talking about the Ebola viral disease. And we hope we've been able to, like what you said, to educate more and just give more information on that. And what you said, that it's all about you as well, what you're able to know about this virus going forward. Thank you for watching Morning Express today. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a lovely day.